Yeah, literally. I think it's quite nice to just kind of sit back and listen to something.
Yeah, well, amazing. Thank you so much for organizing this. Natalie, thank you too for coming and joining me in this little deep dive into women's music history during the European Enlightenment. And I've titled the lecture today between privilege and precarity, and I'm going to discuss 4 composers sort of as different case studies of women's historical participation in musical life. They're Marianna Martines, Josepha Auernhammer, Maria Theresia Paradis, and Helene Liebmann. I acknowledge that all of these are not canon composers, so I will give you a brief biographical rundown for them, together with introducing you to some of their compositions, and of course, tangled up with that also their individual life circumstances. I should say that I had prepared recordings of various pieces of these composers, and I had planned on playing some excerpts for you, but unfortunately my external hard drive gave up on me last week, so I won't be able to play these videos, but I do have some snippets of pieces on YouTube, so I will use those instead. They're maybe not quite the excerpts I would have wanted, but we'll roll with it. So, as these 4 examples will demonstrate, while women obviously contributed in significant ways to musical goings-on, and that is true throughout history, their pathways for doing so were varied and affected by a range of different circumstances and intersectional elements that shaped their identity and their reality. What that means is that women's agency in music was contingent and deeply embedded in the social structures of their surroundings. And to illustrate this, we will look at, as I said, various biographical trajectories of these select composers, their individual strategies for pursuing music in various capacities. And these strategies often meant that they pursued music not as professionals. Many upper-class women did so under the guise of dilettantism, but the level of involvement and seriousness with which they, especially the examples I'm discussing today, with which they engaged with music requires us to view this label of the dilettante not as a mark of quality, but rather a nod to the background. So Martines is a prime example for this. We often make the mistake of judging music histories by androcentric standards. We judge the quality of an artist by the amount of public performances, publications, newspaper reviews, and so on. This explains why someone like Martines must necessarily fall through the cracks. She never performed in public, she only had 2 of her pieces published, and despite being mentioned here and there in the papers, she steered clear of anything that would have transgressed too far into the public sphere. Naturally, as a woman, her opportunities were not the same as those of men, but we must also assume that this was a deliberate choice to a degree and an expression of personal agency and not a result, obviously, of lacking ability. Martines, as an upper middle class woman and eventually actually aristocratic woman, would not have wanted to be fully active in the public sphere, as that would have threatened her standing in society. Naturally, there were systemic oppressions present, but still, as social historians often point out, an individual's act of alignment, conversion, or even submission do not necessarily amount to a loss of subjectivity and agency. So it is important to acknowledge the nuance in Martines's and also other women composers' situations. Martines was quite literally celebrated as a musical genius by her contemporaries. Here we have a comment by Giovanni Battista Mancini, who remembered Martines in his 77 Riflessioni pratiche sul canto figurato as possessing superior genius for music. But still, Martines did not claim the title of professional composer or any other professional label. Yet the amount of music she wrote, the quality of music, and the impact her music also had on her surroundings, on her contemporaries, leave no doubt whatsoever as to her vocational approach to music. Given Martines' status, among musical elites, as well as not insignificant public recognition for her achievements, I use the term publicly private to describe Martinez's position as a non-professional dilettante who never transgressed into the public sphere, yet found herself repeatedly in the public eye. These achievements that drew attention to her included, for instance, becoming the first ever woman to be admitted into the Accademia Filarmonica di Bologna, or having one of her oratorios performed by a prestigious orchestra in Vienna, and several other quasi-professional achievements and wider recognition, such as several mentions in Schönfeld's Yearbook of Music from 1796, where he lauded her as one of Vienna's foremost saloniers. Luckily, a decent amount of archival sources are available for Martinez, including a short autobiography that she wrote. She was born in 1744 and lived to see the beginning of the 19th century. Her parents were Maria Theresia and Niccolo Martinez, and among her surviving siblings are her brother Joseph, 3 other brothers, and then her sister, who was born 2 years after Marianna. Of all the siblings, Joseph, the eldest brother, and Antonia were probably the most important for Martinez, as they spent their entire lives living together. They literally shared a household since none of them ever got married. And this unmarried status was also a double-edged sword for Martinez, because on the one hand, it prevented her from potentially landing in an ill-fated marriage that would have prevented her from pursuing music, but it also meant that even more restrictive and strict rules applied to her, rules and expectation regarding her social conduct that many voices of the 18th century in Vienna commented on. And because Vienna was particularly plagued with an endemic of unmarried women, as contemporaries described it, the reaction to them was even harsher than sort of base level 18th century social pressures. Martinez's father had originally come to Vienna to serve the papal nuncio. As the name Martinez suggests, the family was of Spanish descent, but the father had actually come from Naples, so Spanish, Italian, Austrian. The background of Martinez's mother, Maria Theresia, is currently unknown, other than that she was described as German, which in the context means Austrian. After a few years in Vienna, they moved in with the almost completely newly appointed court poet Pietro Metastasio. And they literally lived in the same apartment with Metastasio in the Michaela house, which is depicted on the screen here. The Michaela house is located next to St. Michael's Church. And that's quite central in Vienna. Metastasio was probably the most famous opera librettist to have ever lived. And he would become incredibly important for Martinez, as it was under his guidance that she received musical and also general education. Then serendipity struck as well, because in 1749, Joseph Haydn, then 17 years old, who had just been kicked out of the boys' choir of St. Stephen Cathedral, he also moved into the Michaela house. He took a room in the attic, which was cheap and probably the only thing he could afford. And a little later, Niccolò Porpora, another famous composer and opera composer especially, also moved into the Michaela house. And Martinez, presumably through Metastasio's arrangements and connections, got voice lessons with Porpora, keyboard lessons with Haydn, and Haydn also accompanied her singing lessons with Porpora. So quite the elite teacher lineup. In 1761, then, Padre Martini and Metastasio struck up what would become a 10-year correspondence, which Metastasio used to introduce the friar to Martinez's compositions. Padre Martini was for a while the most influential member of the Accademia Filarmonica di Bologna, and he arranged to have Martinez's membership with the Accademia put up for vote, and indeed in 1773 She was unanimously voted in as the first ever woman to have this honor bestowed upon her. And becoming a member back then was sort of the ultimate stamp of approval that a composer could get. Mozart would also be a member eventually. In the 1760s, Martines had already written several sacred works, including motets and masses. The probably first ever performance of one of her compositions was a mass that was played in St. Michael's Church, you remember, just next to the Michaela house where they lived. And we luckily know the exact date because it was published in a newspaper, sort of a short review about the virtuoso, the 16-year-old virtuoso who had written this mass. In 1764, Martines' father, Niccolo died, and the following year, Metastasio, one must assume confronted with mortality after his friend's passing, drew up his will and made Joseph, the eldest brother, his main heir, and also left significant sums of money for Martines and her sister Antonia, which was really important because being unmarried, they did not have a husband to provide for them, which was the usual model that worked in the 18th century in this context. In 1762 and 65, Johann Ulrich Haffner published 2 keyboard sonatas by Martines in his Raccolta Musicale, and these 2 sonatas have something of a special position among Martines' oeuvre, as they're the only 2 published pieces of hers. I will try to play a short excerpt of the E major sonata, one of those published sonatas. Let's see if it works. Now, as we know from sources such as Charles Burney's journals, who got to know Martines during his visit to the Habsburg lands, Vienna was notoriously bad for having music available in print. Yet still others like Josepha Auernhammer, for instance, who was also based in Vienna, had significantly more printed. Given Martines' and Metastasio's connections, we must assume that this is not something Martines actively wanted to pursue, likely in her efforts to maintain her publicly private status and her status as a non-professional. Then, as mentioned, 1773, she became a member of the Accademia in Bologna, and that was also widely publicized in newspapers. And these newspaper articles also hinted towards the protection that the Habsburg Empress Maria Theresia had extended towards the Martines siblings. And this was then somewhat confirmed when the following year, 1774, the Martines siblings were ennobled by said empress. They were elevated into the Ritterstand knighthood, which is essentially lower-ranking aristocracy in Austria, or was. Austria is not a monarchy anymore. And here, I think it warrants a moment of reflection because of the fact that Martines was 30 years old when they were elevated into lower-ranking aristocracy, yet still she had spent pretty much her entire life already adhering to the implicit social rules and constraints of upper-class aristocratic women. I mean, her fashioning herself as a publicly private, emphasis on private individual, this almost suggests a certain amount of premeditation, or at the very least, a kind of dress for the job you want, not the one you have approach. And if not that, it does at the very least point towards the Martines siblings striving for social mobility. In 1781, Martines composed one of her 2 oratorios, a very large-scale work, and She wrote it after a libretto by Metastasio, like a lot of her compositions. The oratorio was probably a kind of homage to Metastasio also. He actually died a month after it was premiered by the Tonkünstlersozietät in 1782. This orchestra, or society with an orchestra, the Tonkünstlersozietät, which was originally founded in 1771, was supported through the patronage of Empress Maria Theresia with the express purpose of providing financial assistance to widows and orphans of Austrian musicians. Its funds were deployed to take care of old, sick, and impoverished members, and the society was in a way an early version of an organized professional body of Austrian musicians, predominantly members of the Imperial Orchestra. Repertoire-wise, their focus lay indeed on large-scale oratorios such as Isacco. And again, Martines was a bit of a trailblazer for women. In an 1871 publication about the Tonkünstler, the author pointed out that during the, by then, 100-year history of the orchestra, Martines was still the only woman composer to have ever been programmed. What is interesting about this oratorio is also the parallels to Mozart's Singspiel, his German opera, Die Entführung aus dem Serail. Not only were two of the singers who premiered both pieces the same, but also musically there are several parallels in the way that the overture and the opening arias, respectively, are structured. I don't have enough time to go into it, but I write about it extensively in my DPhil thesis. Martines had written Isacco the year prior, so in 81, and it was premiered March 82, while Mozart's Entführung was premiered July 82, so we can pretty safely assume that she wrote it first. And this is probably not the only case where Mozart maybe, copies without citing Martines. There is actually an unambiguously direct quote in his flute concerto. He quotes the opening of Martines's second movement of the A major keyboard concerto. And this is actually not so far-fetched because the two of them were associated. We know that they performed together in Martines' salons and they knew of each other. There is a lot more that could be said about Martines, and I encourage everyone to read up on her some more. Here are some reading suggestions, but I will now move on to the next composer on our list, which is Josepha Auernhammer, who was born not too long after Martines and also into a similar circumstance in an upper middle class family, but her musical journey could not have been more different from that of Martines. Where Martines carefully maintained her publicly private persona, Auernhammer actively pursued a public career as a performer and published an unusually large volume of her compositions, something which she was actually criticized for by contemporaries. Here we have an example of a review of her Opus 63, a set of variations, where the reviewer mainly takes issue with this being her 63rd opus, which according to him is, quote, a bit much for the public occupation of a lady. Like Martines, Auernhammer enjoyed an excellent musical education. Among her teachers were some of Vienna's most sought-after piano pedagogues, such as Leopold Kotzeluch or Georg Friedrich Richter. And then from 1781 onwards, Mozart was her teacher. From a historiographical perspective, Mozart inhabits an interestingly ambiguous role in Auernhammer's reception history. On the one hand, he was obviously a really important teacher for her, and his posthumous fame also somewhat legitimized interest in her archive before people acknowledged that women can be interesting of their own accord. On the other hand, though, Mozart was also most distortive for Auernhammer's, especially also posthumous reputation, due to a large volume of extremely derogatory and disparaging things he wrote about her in his letters. However, considering that Mozart and Auernhammer performed in concert together on multiple occasions, it is doubtful whether he actually had as low an opinion of her as seems in some of his writings, though he did not have anything particularly positive to say about her as a pianist. It was actually mostly her looks that he berated in the most hostile way imaginable. He also alleged that Auernhammer was in love with him, though judging even solely from Mozart's own heavily biased accounts, it appears to the modern reader that she may have been more interested in his professional connections rather than in him as a potential romantic partner. One of those hostile accounts is in a letter to Mozart's father, where he describes Auernhammer by likening her to the devil, commenting on her, according to him, obese body, and her too revealing, one must assume for his innocent eyes, fashion choices. He then went on to call her boastful, truly the pot calling the kettle black, and also includes some nasty remarks about her mother. There are a whole lot more comments that Mozart made about Auernhammer that are really less than nice. Interestingly, Auernhammer had originally intended to pursue a career as a touring artist. We learn from another Mozart letter that she had planned on going to Paris to make piano playing her profession. She also intended to stay single. She did not want to be shackled to some Viennese clerk who made a passable living. Instead, she intended to live off her talents. It did not come to that, though. Auernhammer remained in Vienna, and in 1986, she married the kind of clerk she apparently said she did not want. Though we don't actually know if this was a love match or not. She may have been very happy with it in the end. She had 3 children with her husband, but she continued to perform very regularly in Vienna. In fact, around the turn of the century, she gave pretty much yearly concerts in the Burgtheater, which was one of Vienna's biggest and most important concert stages. Reading between the lines of the sources that we have available, it can be inferred that Auernhammer was an extraordinary pianist. She must have been. In support of this assessment are also her keyboard compositions, which she performed herself, and many of which were published during her life. They require serious skill, both in terms of technique and musicality, and her variations in particular are just downright fireworks of pianistic bravura. One newspaper article outright said, "What Madame Auernhammer composes, only Madame Auernhammer can play." Luckily for me, I was still able to do it, hopefully, somewhat justice. So 5th variation out of the Hungarian variations. Though Auernhammer did not fulfill her dream of becoming a traveling artist with an international career, she continued to perform in Vienna, both in private settings and public concerts. And Auernhammer's daughter, who was also a musician, performed with her mother frequently. Auernhammer ended her public careers in 1813, so about 7 years before she died, leaving really an exceptional legacy as both a composer and a performer. And her extensive oeuvre is particularly keyboard heavy, including many of these highly, highly virtuosic sets of variations, but also several sonatas or a collection of minuets that are quite delightful with artful simplicity. What is interesting and quintessentially characteristic about her keyboard writing is the visual virtuosity in her variations, for instance, which includes like frequent crossing of hands, extended sections playing with crossed hands, octave runs in the left hand, and really intricate and virtuosic, ornate passages. It is very, very clearly the writing of a skilled pianist. And I find it fascinating this degree of embodiment of virtuosity and visual virtuosity that is captured in the score. Our next case study is Maria Theresia Paradis. Paradis was also highly active in the production of music in Vienna, but actually also in wider Europe. Schönfeld goes so far as to say she was famous in half of Europe. And not only was she active as a composer, but also, and perhaps primarily, as a performer, and later in life also as an educator. The English encyclopedist Sainsbury praised her for being able to perform a large amount of repertoire from memory, as well as being just generally really highly educated. He also mentions her, as he put it, privation of sight. And that is probably the most well-known fact about Paradis today, that she was a blind composer and pianist. But there's, of course, much more to her. She received an excellent musical education and was an accomplished pianist, organist, singer, and famous as a Wunderkind early on. Her parents enjoyed social proximity to the Habsburg court, though they themselves did not belong to nobility. Her father was a court secretary, and her mother brought with her a family legacy of dancing and dance teachers. Paradis went blind at the age of 3. As she was an only child, she was not sent away to live with childless relatives, which was actually common in bigger families who lacked resources to look after disabled children. But she remained with her parents, and they saw to it that she received all the education she needed, and especially an excellent musical education. Her first formal lessons were given at the age of 7 or 8 on the spinet, and soon after she switched to the piano and organ and had some of the most sought-after piano pedagogues, including Leopold Kozeluch, who, if you remember, also had won Josepha Auernhammer as his students. Paradis' training as a singer was overseen by an Italian composer, Vincenzo Rigini, and possibly also by Antonio Salieri. The sources are not entirely clear on that. But the latter, Salieri, actually also wrote an organ concerto for Paradis. Due to her blindness, she developed special methods that made studying new keyboard repertoire accessible to her. In 1780, she described a keyboard lesson in a letter saying how she has 2 pianos, someone plays something for her, and she starts off by playing it from ear, then working on fingering, but mainly relying on her excellent hearing. Paradis toured Europe between 1783 and 86 as a pianist. She performed both in aristocratic lodgings and in public concerts, and she was accompanied by her mother on these travels. During these years, Paradis spent a significant amount of time in Paris also, where she received additional composition training with Georg Joseph Vogler, but even more important, the 2 of them, Vogler and Paradis, developed a method for setting music in a way that was accessible to a blind composer, so essentially tactile composing. Paradis' blindness was undoubtedly part of her public persona, not unlike public figures today. In the 21st century, Paradis too was accused of faking her blindness. Among her accusers was her own physician, Franz Mesmer, who claimed to have cured her of her blindness, but when her musicianship seemed to suffer simultaneously, she stopped treatment and, quote, relapsed into blindness. He then started rumors that she was only pretending to be blind, likely fearing for his reputation as what I'm sure was an excellent physician with stellar bedside manner. Using the social model of disability, her blindness in many ways did not only intersect with her public persona as a performer, but in a way it likely also aided her in her ability to pursue music to such an exclusive degree. Being disabled allowed her to avoid normative expectations placed upon upper middle class women, such as focusing exclusively or predominantly on finding a suitable marriage match, and not marrying saved her career, possibly, from being cut short by an unsupportive husband, a sad fate that actually many of her students faced. On the other hand, as was demonstrated with Martines, not marrying often also came with additionally and quite severe restrictions placed upon whoever dared to break this unwritten social law and defy gender roles in this way. However, Paradis did not actually have the same expectations placed upon her as a disabled woman. In a way, disability, then called deformity or defect, overrode gender expectations. And being blind in 18th century sensibilities minimized Paradis's desirability as a woman. So usually the socially accepted goal for upper middle class women were first and foremost marriage and motherhood, and these were commonly agreed upon as the usual sources of happiness for any woman, of course. But for Paradis, they were actually not only unavailable, but also unthinkable. Even though she lived together with her partner, Johann Riedinger, whom she met during her travels in Germany, her contemporaries did not acknowledge this relationship for its romantic nature and saw it more as an asexual friendship, even though the two lived together. And there's obviously plenty of evidence that it was very much a real relationship. So a double-edged sword in many ways. During these travels, there were many more destinations that she visited, including London, Frankfurt, Hamburg, Leipzig, Prague, and so on. One of the works associated with her travels are her 12 Lieder, inspired by a travel-themed novel called Sophiens Reise von Memel nach Sachsen. And the 12 songs appear in a way to capture the innate emotions of a traveling artist, especially the first song, which was called An das Klavier, a kind of ode to the piano. It's just a deeply heartfelt and emotional number. And in this song, the protagonist speaks to her beloved piano, saying, only you to the piano, only you to the piano can she properly express and convey all that she feels and all that she would never confess with words to other people. After returning to Vienna, Paradis only rarely performed in public, preferring semi-private or salon, academy settings. As a composer, she started to venture into larger scale territory. She composed cantatas and operas, although unfortunately most of that has been lost, or at least is currently considered lost. Hopefully, maybe we will find some more of her scores in the future. Paradis also opened her home to students, and she taught many girls voice and keyboard, the start of her private music school in many ways. And for one of these students' birthdays, she wrote this piano fantasy in C major. so on. The recording is on YouTube if you're curious to hear the whole thing with the score video. One thing that is interesting to me in someone who approaches these types of compositions both with the hat of a performer but also a researcher is the different types of virtuosity that the various composers display, where Auernhammer had these grand gestures that are very visually impressive on stage and that require a lot of jumping and moving of hands. Our Paradis' music is undoubtedly also virtuosic. It gets quite crazy towards the end with tremolo passages and all across the keyboard. But it is what I would describe as accessible virtuosity that does not require visual confirmation. And it is fascinating to see how it connects to her own description of her pianistic abilities as being able to rely more on her ears than on her hands. The connecting link further between actually Paradis and Martines is an important event in their reception history. In 1844, Caroline Pichler published the third volume of her memoirs. She was sort of an Austrian socialite, we might say today. And in these memoirs, she remembered Martines and Paradis, though these are apparently not very fond memories. She mentions them more or less in passing when wondering out loud why there are no women composers, saying that the only two she's heard of are Martines and Paradis, and they are, according to her, not very good, or as she put it, they were barely mediocre. Pichler's comment was quite damaging for the reception history of both composers. The 19th century was already quite trigger-happy in dismissing women's contributions to music. So towards the end of the century, when Pichler's writings had made the round, so to say, music historians were only too content with copying Pichler's statements without much reflection or actual engagement with the music of the two composers. Now, for our final case study, Helene Liebmann. She presents a slightly different case, not least because she was the only one of our 4 examples today who was not born or was not predominantly based in Vienna. The archive on her has also been much less thoroughly explored so far, and one must fear that a lot was simply not preserved, as is always the risk with, in any way, marginalized individuals. What connects Liebmann to the other composers is her social status as someone belonging to the upper middle class. However, unlike the others, Liebmann was actually born into a Jewish family. Though the archive on her is sparse, it is very clear that navigating this Jewish identity and heritage was a big concern throughout her and her family's life. Liebmann's father Meyer Ries, so Liebmann was born Helene Riese. Her father Meyer Ries was a banker. He eventually changed the family name to Riese. This was to replace the transliteration of the Yiddish word Ries, meaning giant. And they replaced it with the German translation of the word Riese. So in a way, they were subtly emphasizing a more Germanic identity. This is significant for understanding then also Liebmann's own name change later in life when she changed her married name from Liebmann to Liebert. Very little is currently known about Liebmann's mother, Jittel Beer, only that she was a distant relation to the Mendelssohn family. Helene Liebmann, or Riese, received a thorough musical education, like all the others of upper middle class background. And this was very much in line with German practices, but especially also with German Jewish bourgeois practices that saw music really as an essential part of elite education, serving in a way as a vehicle for increased assimilation and negotiation of European culture. She received lessons from sought-after and well-connected instructors in Berlin, including Franz Lausker, who also taught Giacomo Meyerbeer. Early performances as a pianist were celebrated in the press. Her first recorded stage performance in Berlin was at 9 years old, and her repertoire included a broad variety of solo works and concerti. At 17 years old, in 1813, Helene Riese, freshly converted to Christianity, married a merchant from London by the name of John Joseph Liebmann. And the following year, the couple moved to London, where they would remain until 1819. In London, Liebmann received lessons from Ferdinand Ries. During her English stint, she mainly composed chamber music and actually dedicated one of her trios to Ries, who was also originally from Germany and who had settled in London in 1813. Ferdinand Ries may be familiar to you. He was acquainted with Beethoven, and he actually kept up his correspondence with Beethoven even after his move to England. And he was extremely well integrated into the local music scene through his affiliation with central players such as George Smart. After moving back to Germany, to Hamburg specifically in 1818, the Liebmanns changed their name to Liebert. This was essentially a more Christian-sounding version of their name. The couple likely chose to take this measure as a response to rising anti-Semitism in Germany and Europe in general. This interpretation of events is plausible as it is a continuing trend in the Riese-Liebmann family in their efforts to assume and emphasize a more Germanic identity. The name change potentially also suggests that John Joseph Liebmann may have been a converted Christian too. Similar measures were taken by many other Jewish-born individuals from Central Europe, where often entire families underwent conversions. Though there are no surviving accounts of Liebmann or her family addressing their Jewish heritage, their actions allow for some careful insight into their sense of safety and security and social belonging in Europe. After all, converting, that is, being perceived as less Jewish, often meant a bolstering of one's social status, as well as gaining professional opportunities and generally just more comfort. That is, besides the obvious striving for the benefit of escaping stigma and to conform to the dominant culture, which did not actually always work, though, especially wherever Judaism was seen as a race rather than as a religion. In reality, it's probably both. Liebmann's first few opuses of her compositions were published in 1811 and reviewed in the Allgemeine Musikalische Zeitung very positively. They were quite well received, though the compliments in the review are so backhanded that they can really barely be considered such. It demonstrates really powerfully the pushback that women composers experienced. Similarly to Pichler, though this is quite a bit earlier, the reviewer asserts that women have essentially contributed nothing to musical composition or even performance, never rising above sort of amateur, diligent work ethic. The review goes on to marvel at how this particular, quote, composition of a lady caused him to forget his initial trepidation, which he had felt at the prospect of having to play and review women's music. All he had previously come across, so the review states, was merely what some currently fashionable composer, one could usually identify and name him immediately, had already said and repeated more weakly and in different words. So women, in his opinion, lacked skill and imagination. He appeared even more astonished at finding him enjoying Liebmann's Opus 1 and 2 sonatas. The second one in particularly captivated his attention, and his incredulity went so far that he, quote, repeatedly opened the title page to assure himself that he was indeed performing the composition of a lady. The review of her first publication was accounting for the latent misogyny of the time, quite outstanding, but not so the third piano sonata, which was a grand sonata. The critique of Liebmann's Grand Sonata mainly takes issue with the genre, stating Liebmann was not made for the grand and profound and would do better aiming for something pleasant and brilliant. The attestation of grand genres were not something to be trifled with, especially by women, it seemed, and that was not unique to Liebmann's critique. Her reviews are an interesting addition, though, to our understanding of women composers in the 19th century. Even her positive reviews in a way were deeply misogynistic. A later review of two of her trios categorizes Liebmann's music predominantly as women's music, stating that it was probably gonna gain some female admirers among skilled amateurs. The review adds somewhat blasé, oh here we have the title page of the Opus 3 Grand Sonata. So this review adds that, of course, Liebmann's composition is not a matter of art in the higher sense of the word, but merely of lively and pleasant entertainment. Another reviewer noted that Liebmann's trio possesses liveliness and charm and expression, agility in various, especially rapid or otherwise sparkling passages, and that influence which fluent, in a certain sense brilliant manner of playing can also exert upon composition. To them, her music appeared to embody female amateur pianism, stating that amateurs will certainly find much pleasure in the trios, especially when performing them themselves rather than merely listening. The review further highlights the sort of bodily logic with which what I term spatial grammar of the piano part was laid out. It states that the author knows how to keep the performer well occupied, particularly the female pianist, and yet in such a way that everything seems to fall naturally under the fingers while still sounding like something substantial here and there, almost like a concerto. While I would contest the prescription of amateurism for players of Liebmann's music, her scores definitely reveal her skill as a pianist, comparable to some later 19th century composers like Liszt and Chopin. Her writing for the piano feels very natural and inherently logical in its movement patterns. Certain sections suggest her own pianistic preferences, such as a specific kind of left-hand virtuosity consisting of scales, arpeggios, and chromatic runs, as occurs, for instance, in her variations in the Opus 2 Sonata. This spatial grammar, as I term it, and by that I mean this interplay of somatic and kinesthetic qualities of the music, is inherently logical for pianistic embodiment. Her compositions for the piano afford the performer a high level of physical comfort, as the process of learning and memorizing her pieces works seamlessly on a somatic, on a bodily embodied level, despite being both musically engaging and entertaining, with elements of performative showmanship and technical virtuosity that is not unchallenging. It is interesting to explore Liebmann's German Jewish heritage and how she seemed to negotiate it also within her music. Liebmann's composition suggests that she was or wanted to be seen as a German composer. There's no way of ascertaining whether this was motivated by a drive to assimilate, seek safety in the dominant culture, or maybe it was simply as a result of being exposed to exclusively German European music and therefore having developed a taste for it, or maybe it was just a mixture of all of it. In any case, her composition choices do not allow for any meaningful speculations about her personal relationship with Judaism, but still it is interesting to observe the frequency with which she wrote not just non-Jewish but specifically German music, as well as specific choices of German musical references that appear in her music. One of the most direct references to a Germanic musical tradition is contained in the third movement of her Sonata Opus 2, The Allegretto movement is written as a set of variations on the theme of Priacchio l'impegno. This aggressively simple theme was originally by Austrian composer Joseph Weigl from his opera L'amor marinaro or Il Corsaro. Nowadays, most well-known are Beethoven's Gassenhauer variations on the same theme in the final movement of his Opus 11 clarinet trio, which was written in 1798. However, Beethoven was not the only one to do so. Other well-known composers of the time also wrote their own variations. So Liebmann was in pretty good and, importantly, German company, choosing Weigl's popular tune. Her emphasizing the humorous character of the simple tune in a way stands out, while all the variations that were written by the various composers use virtuosity and humor to varying degrees. Liebmann's specific way of using up-tempo and syncopated crossing of hands and accenting of exaggeratedly low bass lines is quite unique and really witty and funny. I do have an excerpt here. Right, so that was one central example for sort of referencing Germanic musical traditions. Another one can be found in yet another set of variations, which is located in the middle section of Liebmann's Fantasy Opus 16, which she dedicated to her brother, and which sort of broadly follows the archetype of sonata form, though takes liberties within it. The variations that replace the traditional development section of a sonata are based on a theme by Reichert. She quotes Reichert's song, Jägers Abendlied, Evening Song of a Huntsman, which is set to a poem by Goethe. And these variations lean less into the comical in contrast to her Opus 2, and instead play with rhythm and meter with each variation. The subdivision of the beats increases from 16th notes to 16th note triplets to 32nd notes until finally we get to a legato variation that sort of interrupts the amping up of virtuosic intensity. Was the beginning of the legato variation. Both Opus 2 and Opus 16, the examples we just heard, make frequent use of the hunt topic. This is interesting from a national and cultural perspective, for the hunt as a leisure activity was highly popular with the bourgeoisie and aristocracy, and in music referencing the hunt was quintessentially German and represented manliness, nobility, adventure, risk, exhilaration. And on top of that, one probably should also point out that the hunt was intrinsically un-Jewish. Hunting was a sign of European elitism, signifying the ritualistic embodiment of social class and ideas of nobleness and masculinity. And while there's no explicit prohibition of hunting in Jewish law, nor a ban on killing animals for food or clothing, the requirements for ritual slaughter effectively prohibit hunting for sport, the way it would have been popular with the European aristocracy and bourgeoisie. In the absence of decisive archival testimony regarding Liebmann's private beliefs or motivation, her music and the contemporary discourse surrounding it may be read as evidence of cultural self-fashioning. Nevertheless, such readings should be pursued with caution because convergence with Germanic musical practices does, of course, not ipso facto demonstrate repudiation of Jewish origins. Rather, Liebmann's case illustrates the complex and often very ambivalent modalities through which cultural belonging and difference were negotiated, expressed, and perceived in this theory, in this period. Liebmann, it appears, saw herself as part of Germany's musical traditions and legacies and fashioned herself as distinctly German in her compositions. She followed musical trends in her choice of topics, genres, cultural motives, and produced her own unique takes on these trends. She also displayed awareness of the central players and musical legacies, especially Beethoven and Reichert, which she apparently saw herself part of, in a way, engaging with it. And in many ways, she played the game by the same rules as the boys did, but unlike the men who fashioned themselves as belonging to the lineage of classical music, a concept that became increasingly important during the 19th century with the project of canonization in progress, Liebmann's efforts were mostly dismissed. In a strange way, it almost seems as though Martinez's contemporaries took much less issue with women composing. No one would have dared to question Martinez's ability as a composer. But as the 19th century commenced with the rise of beliefs in biological determinism, women's ability to do creative work was just fundamentally questioned. And for us in the 21st century, I think it is important to engage with these past realities in nuanced ways and to remind ourselves that there is very much a socially constructed component to musical taste and also to so-called genius works of art. Well, I hope you've enjoyed this journey through this particular corner of music history. Hopefully there will be a lot more that we discover about all of these composers. But until then, we have a lot of music that we can enjoy and that we should play and listen to. I have more recordings on my YouTube channel. If you want to listen to them, if you have any questions, please always feel free to reach out to me.